The unexpected transaction. Jake sat in the dimly lit corner of a rundown space bar on the outer rim of the galaxy. His ship, a rusty old freighter, sat in the docking bay outside, barely holding together. The mission had gone wrong. He'd failed to deliver the cargo on time, and now the warlord was angry. Very angry. He had lost a fortune on this deal. The kind of money he had hoped would finally get him out of debt. But now, with his options running out, Jake found himself face to face with someone who could help, though it wasn't the kind of help he had expected. The warlord Corin was a tall, imposing figure, his deep voice enough to make most men tremble. But Jake had heard rumors about him, rumors that painted a terrifying picture of the warlord's power. Now, Corin was standing right in front of him, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jake, you failed me," Corin growled, his voice low and threatening. "But I'm a man of opportunity. I'll give you a chance to make things right. You'll take payment in a form that will settle your debt. Consider this your last chance." Jake's heart raced. A chance? What kind of payment could fix this mess? He opened his mouth to ask, but Corin raised a hand, cutting him off. "You'll see soon enough. Follow me." The warlord led Jake through the back of the bar, into a dim hallway that smelled of old metal and damp walls. There were no windows, no signs of life, just the distant hum of machinery and the steady beat of Jake's heart in his chest. Corin's footsteps echoed on the metal floor as they walked. At the end of the hall, a heavy door slid open, revealing a small, cold chamber. Inside, chained to the wall, was a figure, an alien woman. Her face was hidden by a hood, but Jake could tell she wasn't human. Her skin had an otherworldly pale tint, and her long silver hair fell in waves around her shoulders. She was sitting on the floor, her head lowered, as if defeated. "She's yours now," Corin said with a smirk, stepping aside. Jake froze. What was this? A slave. He had been expecting credits, maybe a weapon or a ship upgrade, not a living, breathing alien woman. He had heard rumors of slaves being sold in the galaxy, but he never imagined he would be the one to take one. "Why?" Jake asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Why are you giving her to me?" "Payment," Corin answered, his eyes narrowing. "A payment that comes with a price. You'll own her now, Jake. She'll serve you. Keep her under control, or I will come back for her. And when I do, I won't be so forgiving." Jake swallowed hard. His hand shook slightly as he looked at the woman, still not understanding why he had been chosen for this. Corin gave him a hard look before turning to leave. "Make no mistake. She's worth more than you think. Keep her alive, and you may yet make something of yourself. Fail me again, and you won't be so lucky." With that, the warlord left, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. Jake stared at the woman, unsure of what to do next. Her head was still down, her body tense as though she expected him to do something. He took a step closer. You're a slave," he asked softly, his voice uncertain. He hated that word, but he didn't know how else to phrase it. The woman didn't respond at first. She only raised her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. They were dark, almost black, but they held a strange intensity. Something about her gaze unsettled Jake. There was a sharpness in them, a hidden strength that contradicted her current position. "You are not my master," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I will do as you ask. For now." Jake blinked in surprise. This wasn't the broken, defeated slave he had expected. The woman wasn't trembling with fear or begging for mercy. She wasn't like the others he had heard about in the slums. Docile, obedient, easily controlled. There was a fire in her eyes, and it made Jake uneasy. He didn't know what to make of her. She was an alien, probably from a distant world Jake had never heard of. She wasn't the kind of person he had ever imagined getting involved with, but now he had no choice. She was his responsibility. "So, what's your name?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, trying to break the tension. "Lyra," the woman answered simply. I don't belong here." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He could feel the weight of her words, as though they carried a deep meaning. Something more than just the statement of an alien prisoner. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to her. Maybe it was because of her defiance, or maybe it was because of the way she seemed so calm despite her situation. But there was one thing Jake did know. This wasn't going to be as simple as he thought. The warlord had given him more than just a payment. He had given him a puzzle, one that Jake wasn't sure he could solve. Still, one thing was clear. Jake had just stepped into something much bigger than he had ever imagined, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what would happen next. But he knew this. His life was about to change. Jake's growing curiosity. Jake didn't know what he had gotten himself into. The woman, Lyra, sat silently in the corner of the ship's small living quarters, her back straight, her eyes never meeting his. For the first few days, things were quiet. She did what he asked, silently, almost like a shadow. Jake gave her food, water, and a place to rest, but there was something unsettling about the silence between them. At first, Jake didn't press her for conversation. She wasn't his friend after all. She was a slave. That's how he saw her at first, just another piece of property in a universe that cared little for the lives of those like her. But as the days passed, something about her intrigued him. It wasn't just her striking silver hair or the way she carried herself like a queen. It was the fact that she never truly seemed like a slave at all. She never looked desperate or broken, like the others he had seen before. No, Lyra was different. Jake found himself thinking about her more and more. She wasn't the frightened, obedient type. Her presence was like a silent storm, always there, building beneath the surface, just waiting to break free. He could sense the power inside her, even though she barely spoke. One evening, as the ship coasted through the dark void of space, Jake couldn't stand it any longer. He had to know more about her. What made her tick? What was hiding behind those quiet, intense eyes? "Lyra," Jake said, trying to sound casual as he set down a plate of food in front of her. "You've been here for a while now, and you still haven't told me much about yourself. Who are you really? Why did Corin give you to me? What's your story?" Lyra didn't immediately respond. She simply stared out the small porthole, her face lit by the faint glow of distant stars. Jake waited, giving her space to answer. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Do you want the truth, Jake?" she asked, not looking at him. The truth isn't easy to hear. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. There was something about the way she said it, something that made his heart beat a little faster. He nodded, his curiosity overpowering any fear or hesitation. "I'm not just any slave," she continued. "I'm the last of a royal bloodline. My people were once a mighty civilization, powerful and advanced. But they were wiped out. My family, my kingdom, all gone." Jake blinked in confusion. "What do you mean, wiped out? What happened to them?" Lyra finally turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were full of sadness, but there was also a fire in them, an unspoken strength that Jake couldn't ignore. "We were betrayed," she said. "My family's kingdom was attacked by another alien race. They destroyed everything we built, and I was captured. The warlord, Corin, he's just one of many who have taken part in erasing my people's existence. But I'm not just a prisoner. I'm the last heir to the throne of my kingdom." Jake's heart raced. This wasn't the story he expected. He had thought she was just a simple slave, someone broken by the cruel hands of the galaxy. But now, Lyra's words made him see her in a completely new light. "You're royalty?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had trouble grasping it. The woman who sat quietly, who had never raised her voice in anger or protest, was a princess, the last of her kind. Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes, but I'm not here to claim your sympathy, Jake. I've had enough of pity. I was born to rule, and my people deserve to be remembered. I didn't ask for this life, but I have no choice now. I must survive. And one day, I will return to my people's homeworld to reclaim what was taken from me." Jake stared at her, processing the gravity of her words. He didn't know what to say. The silence in the room felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of her history. "Why didn't you fight back when Corin took you?" Jake asked, a little confused. If she truly was royalty, why hadn't she fought for her freedom? Lyra's eyes flashed with something that Jake couldn't quite understand. "I did fight back," she replied sharply. "But when you're outnumbered and outmatched, survival becomes your only option. I've learned to choose my battles carefully, Jake. And when I fight to win." Jake wasn't sure what to say. He felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. How could someone like Lyra have survived all that? He had always thought of the universe as a place of cold, unforgiving survival. But this was something different. Her story wasn't just about loss. It was about strength, about resilience. Jake had been living in a world of his own mistakes, trapped by debts and bad decisions. But Lyra, she was a survivor, a warrior in disguise. "I didn't want to be caught up in your world," Lyra continued. "But I don't have a choice now. If you think I'm just a slave, you're wrong. I've seen more of this universe than you could ever dream of. I've lost everything. But I will not stay silent. One day I will take back what's mine." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just a woman he was sharing his ship with anymore. Lyra was someone with a purpose that was far bigger than anything Jake could have imagined. But as he looked at her, Jake couldn't help but wonder, what had he just walked into? The first clue, a hidden mark. The days blurred together as Jake continued his journey through the stars. Lyra had become a constant presence on his ship, her silent strength filling the small space with a tension he couldn't quite shake. They didn't talk much, but Jake found himself thinking about her more and more. It wasn't just her strange, quiet demeanor. It was the mystery that seemed to surround her. Something about Lyra wasn't right. And the more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't simply keeping her as a slave. There was something hidden, something deep within her past that she wasn't sharing. Every time he tried to press her for more information, she would close off, like a locked door with no key. It wasn't until one evening, while they were both in the ship's small galley, that Jake saw something, a small mark on Lyra's arm. It wasn't something he would have noticed if she hadn't reached out to grab the cup of water he handed her. As her sleeve pulled back, Jake caught a glimpse of a strange, intricate symbol etched into her pale skin. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any mark. It was a tattoo, but not like the ones you'd see on ordinary people. The design was intricate, almost glowing in the dim light. A series of lines and shapes that seemed to swirl together, forming an emblem he recognized only from stories. It was a royal insignia, one of a long-lost empire he had heard of only in hushed whispers, a civilization that was thought to have vanished without a trace centuries ago. Before Jake could say anything, Lyra quickly pulled her sleeve down, hiding the mark once more. Her eyes flickered with something Jake hadn't seen before, fear, perhaps, or maybe regret. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, almost exposed. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than he intended. He wasn't sure if he was more curious or afraid. Lyra didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a slow breath, setting the cup down on the table. The silence between them felt thick, like the air had grown heavier, charged with something unspoken. "It's nothing," she said at last, her voice low and controlled. "Just a mark from a long time ago. It means nothing." Jake wasn't convinced. He had seen enough in his life to know when someone was hiding something. And Lyra, she was definitely hiding something. Her reaction, the way her hand shook ever so slightly as she pulled her sleeve down. It was all a clue. This wasn't just a random symbol. It was important, and it was connected to her past. "I've seen it before," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "That symbol, I've heard about it. It's from the lost civilization, isn't it? The one that disappeared without a trace. Lyra's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Jake swore he could see a flicker of something ancient, something powerful, behind them. It was like the weight of centuries of history was pressing down on her, making it hard for her to breathe. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, her voice sharp now, almost warning him. "I don't want to drag you into this. You don't know what you're asking." Jake swallowed, but his curiosity had been ignited. He couldn't stop now. "But why are you hiding it? You said you're royalty. This proves it. You're not just a slave. You're something else, something much more important than that." Lyra stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the metal floor. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling now, just slightly. "The mark isn't just a symbol. It's a curse. If you keep digging into this, you'll regret it." Jake stood up too, his eyes never leaving her. There was something desperate in her eyes, but also something dangerous. "What curse? What's happened to you, Lyra? Why don't you want me to know?" For a moment, they just stared at each other, the tension crackling in the air between them. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no turning back now. He had to know the truth. "I'm not just the last of a royal bloodline," Lyra said, her voice quieter now, as if the weight of the words was too much to bear. "My people were destroyed because of that mark. The curse that comes with it, it doesn't just mark us as royalty. It marks us for death. My family was hunted down, one, by those who wanted to wipe us out completely. And I'm next." Jake's mouth went dry. This wasn't the story he had expected. He had assumed that her royal bloodline was something to be proud of, something she would want to reclaim. But now, it sounded like something much darker, a legacy tied to death, destruction, and danger. "You're telling me that because of this symbol, your entire family was wiped out?" Jake asked, struggling to understand. "And now you're on the run because of it?" Lyra nodded, her eyes distant. "Yes, every part of me is tied to that mark, to the downfall of my people. If anyone sees it, truly sees it, they'll know who I am. And they'll come after me, just like they came after the rest of my family." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He had thought his life was difficult, filled with debts and bad deals. But compared to what Lyra had been through, his problems seemed trivial. This wasn't just a woman with a tragic past. This was someone who carried the weight of an entire civilization's destruction on her shoulders. For the first time, Jake saw Lyra for who she truly was, not a slave, not a victim, but a survivor of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. And whatever secret she was holding back, he knew one thing for sure. He was in this now. There was no turning back. Unveiling the truth. The days that followed were tense. Jake couldn't shake the image of the mark from his mind, nor the fear that had crept into Lyra's voice. Every time he tried to bring it up, she would close off, turning cold and distant. But something had shifted. He could feel it. Lyra was no longer the quiet, obedient woman he had first met. She had secrets, secrets that seemed to weigh heavily on her, like chains that no one could see. He tried to put it out of his mind, focusing on the mundane tasks of keeping the ship running. But even as he worked, he could feel Lyra's presence in the background, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Jake had always been the type to keep his head down and move forward. But this time, he couldn't ignore it. He had to know more. He had to understand what was really going on. One evening, as the stars outside the ship streaked past like ribbons of light, Jake found himself sitting across from Lyra in the small common area. He hadn't planned it, but as the silence stretched between them, it was clear that something needed to be said. "Lyra," Jake started, his voice a little rough. "I know you're not telling me everything. And I get it. I don't expect you to open up right away. But we can't keep living like this. You're not just some prisoner. You're something else, something important. I just need you to trust me." She didn't answer right away. Her fingers played nervously with the hem of her sleeve, her eyes lowered, avoiding his gaze. For a moment, Jake thought she might push him away again. But then, slowly, she lifted her head, and Jake saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before: vulnerability. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though bracing herself for something painful. Then, with a deep sigh, she spoke. "I'm not just running from my past, Jake," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm running from a war that destroyed everything I knew. My people, my family, were once rulers of a vast empire. We were feared, respected, but that power made us targets." Jake leaned in, sensing the gravity of her words. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Lyra paused, looking out of the window at the endless stretch of space. "It wasn't just one enemy," she said. "We were betrayed from within. People who we thought were loyal turned against us, gave us up to those who wanted to see us fall. It was like a well-planned massacre. My family was slaughtered, one by one, until only I remained. And even then, they came for me. But they didn't just want me dead. They'd wanted me erased from history." Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she must have endured to lose everything: her family, her kingdom, her life, as she knew it. "Why didn't you fight back?" Jake asked, unable to keep the question from slipping out. "Why didn't you use your power to stop them?" Lyra's eyes darkened, her expression tightening as though the question had cut too deep. "I did fight. I fought with everything I had," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "But there's more to this than just power, Jake. My people were not just rulers. We were chosen for something far greater. We were connected to an ancient force, a power that was meant to guide the universe. But the more we used it, the more dangerous it became. We were not just destroying our enemies, we were destroying ourselves." Jake didn't fully understand what she meant, but the pain in her voice was undeniable. Lyra had been more than just a princess. She had been a part of something ancient and powerful, something that had led to her people's downfall. "What are you saying?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That your power was the reason your family fell?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Yes, my family thought they could control it, use it for good. But the power was too much. It destroyed them. And now it's inside me. The curse of my bloodline is that we're bound to this power. I'm the last one left, Jake. The last one with the mark of my people's legacy." Jake was silent, processing her words. The weight of her truth was more than he had expected. She wasn't just running from a past of loss. She was carrying a burden, a curse, one that she couldn't escape. And now she was dragging him into it, whether she liked it or not. "What happens now?" Jake finally asked, his voice softer. "What are you going to do?" Lyra's gaze was distant, almost like she was looking at something far beyond the confines of the ship. "I don't know. Every day I run, I wonder if I'm making things worse. The power inside me is growing stronger. If I don't find a way to control it, I might become the very thing my people feared. And then I'll be no different from the ones who destroyed us." Jake didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? He had no answers for her, no solutions. He was just a man who had gotten caught up in something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. But one thing was clear: Lyra wasn't just a woman on the run. She was a force of nature, carrying the weight of an entire civilization's downfall. And whatever path she chose, whatever future lay ahead, Jake knew he was in this with her. There was no turning back. The threat that looms. Jake had been through his fair share of dangerous situations, but none like this. As he navigated the ship through the vast emptiness of space, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. The calm, empty void around them felt wrong now, like it was holding its breath. He wasn't alone in this. Lyra felt it too. The air between them had shifted in the last few days. She was more restless, more on edge, as though she could sense a storm brewing on the horizon. Late one night, as Jake was monitoring the ship's systems, Lyra appeared at the door of the cockpit. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp with something Jake hadn't seen in her before. Fear. "They're coming," she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. Jake didn't have to ask who she meant. He had known, deep down, that the silence couldn't last. The hunters, the ones who had wiped out her family and her kingdom, the ones who had been waiting for her to slip up. It was only a matter of time before they found her. "How do you know?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, his heart was racing. Lyra's gaze shifted to the navigation console, and Jake saw the tension in her posture. She wasn't just frightened, she was preparing for something. "I can feel them. It's not just my past catching up with me. They have a way of tracking me. They know who I am, what I am." Jake's mind raced. Whoever they were powerful. But there was something about Lyra, something he still didn't fully understand, that seemed to draw their attention. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was a target, a symbol of something that could never be forgotten. "They won't stop," Lyra continued, her voice almost a whisper. "I've been running for years, but every time I think I'm safe, they find me. And the worst part is, I'm running out of places to hide." Jake's stomach dropped. "How long do we have?" "Not long," she replied, her expression grim. "They won't give up. They're relentless. And they're getting closer." Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. Lyra wasn't just running from her past. Her enemies were closing in, and they wouldn't rest until they had destroyed everything she represented. Jake wasn't sure what he could do to help, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the growing fear in his chest. Lyra paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the ship. "We can't outrun them," she said finally. "But maybe we can fight. Maybe we can turn the tables for once." Jake didn't know if he was ready for a fight of this magnitude. His whole life had been about avoiding trouble, getting by just enough to stay afloat. But now, with Lyra's fate, and possibly his own, hanging in the balance, he realized that running wasn't an option anymore. "How do we fight them?" he asked, his voice full of determination. Lyra's lips twitched into a slight, knowing smile. "We have a plan," she said, her eyes narrowing. "We need to head to an old planet, one that was abandoned long ago. It's off the grid, a place they wouldn't think to look. But it's also a place that holds the answers I need. And if we're lucky, it will give us the chance to take the fight to them." Jake didn't ask any more questions. He could see the fire in her eyes now. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to reclaim what had been taken from her, to stop those who had destroyed everything she once held dear. As they set course for the abandoned planet, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Lyra was right. Running was no longer an option. The hunters were too close, and they were coming for her. But if they were going to have a chance, they needed to get there first. The planet was old, forgotten by most of the galaxy, but it held secrets that might give Lyra the strength she needed. Jake wasn't sure what to expect when they arrived, but one thing was clear. They weren't just running anymore. They were preparing for a fight. As the ship hummed with energy, Jake glanced over at Lyra. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The world as they knew it was about to change. And with it, the fate of everything Lyra had lost. But this time, she wasn't running. This time, she would fight to the end. A plan to reclaim the throne. The stars outside the ship grew distant as the ship entered the outer orbit of the abandoned planet. The atmosphere was thick with a strange kind of tension, the kind you feel before something big happens, when everything seems to hold its breath. Inside the ship, the quiet was broken only by the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clink of tools from the ship's workshop, where Jake had been tinkering with the weapon systems. Lyra had retreated to her quarters, her mind clearly elsewhere. But Jake couldn't help but notice how focused she had become over the past few days. There was a shift in her, an intensity that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the woman just running from her past. Now she was a woman preparing for war, determined to take back what was stolen from her. Jake knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The enemies Lyra spoke of were ruthless, skilled, and relentless. He had never faced anything like this, but something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the way Lyra spoke of her people, of her past. Maybe it was the fire he saw in her eyes. But whatever it was, Jake was done running. The sound of footsteps echoed through the ship, and Jake turned to see Lyra standing in the doorway of the cockpit. She looked different, calmer, more collected, like a leader preparing to reclaim her kingdom. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady. "It's time. We can't keep hiding. It's time to take the fight to them, to the ones who have been hunting me down for so long." Jake didn't say anything at first. He had expected this moment, the moment when Lyra would finally decide to fight back. But hearing it out loud made the weight of it all hit him with full force. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but unsure. "How do we fight them?" Lyra's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jake saw the full scope of the plan forming in her mind. "I have a weapon, a secret weapon, something I've kept hidden for a long time. It's here, on this planet. My family once stored their most valuable artifacts in a vault deep underground. It's a place few know about. If I can reach it, I'll have the strength to fight back, to reclaim what was lost." Jake felt a chill run through him. The way Lyra spoke of this vault, this weapon, was different. It wasn't just a tool for battle. It was something ancient, something powerful. And it was clear that this was more than just a physical fight. This was a battle for everything Lyra had ever known, everything she had lost. "You're saying we can win with this?" Jake asked, his eyes narrowing. "You can really take back your throne with whatever's down there?" Lyra's face softened, but the determination didn't leave her eyes. "I don't know what's down there, Jake. But I do know that my people's legacy isn't just about power, it's about purpose. The artifacts in that vault were meant to protect my family's rule. They were never meant to fall into the wrong hands. If I can get to it, it will give me the strength to finally stand against those who destroyed us." Jake nodded slowly. It was starting to make sense now. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight to honor the past, to restore balance to the galaxy. Lyra wasn't just seeking revenge. She was seeking redemption for her people, a redemption that had been long overdue. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. "Whatever it takes, I'll help you get there. We can't let them win." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of trust there, a trust that had been slowly growing between them. She knew she couldn't do this alone. And for the first time, Jake felt like he had a purpose, something greater than himself to fight for. The planet's surface came into view, a barren, desolate world that seemed to have been abandoned for centuries. It was the perfect place to hide something powerful. Jake set the ship down in a rocky clearing, far from any signs of civilization. They would have to make their way on foot to the vault, and the journey wouldn't be easy. "We'll need to move quickly," Lyra said, already preparing herself for the trek. "The vault is deep underground, hidden beneath an ancient ruin. But the path is dangerous. There are traps, and the enemies we've been running from may have already made their way here." Jake swallowed, his mind racing. They were walking straight into danger, but there was no other choice. He looked at Lyra, standing tall and ready, a queen preparing to reclaim her kingdom. "We'll make it," Jake said, more to himself than to her. "We'll get what you need, and we'll take back what's yours." With that, they stepped off the ship, the weight of their mission settling over them like a heavy cloak. This was the moment that would determine everything. There was no going back. Lyra had made her choice, and Jake had made his. They were in this together, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. As they made their way through the rugged landscape toward the ruins, the air felt charged with something, anticipation, perhaps, or the promise of something bigger. Jake didn't know what they would find in the vault, but whatever it was, he knew it would change everything. For Lyra, for her people, and for him. The final showdown. The ruins loomed ahead, ancient and crumbling under the weight of time. The planet felt forgotten, its surface a barren testament to a lost civilization. But Lyra knew that deep beneath the decaying stone, within the heart of the long-abandoned vault, lay the answers she needed, and if they were lucky, it would give her the strength to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. Jake stayed close, his eyes scanning the shadows as they carefully navigated through the narrow passageways. They had made it this far, past the traps, past the treacherous terrain. But the real challenge was just beginning. The vault wasn't just a hidden chamber, it was a fortress, designed to protect not just the artifacts of her people, but the legacy of a royal bloodline that had been erased from history. Lyra moved with purpose, her face set in determination. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a warrior. And with every step, the weight of her ancestors seemed to press down on her. She had come to reclaim her throne, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever believed in her family's rule. "Stay alert," Lyra whispered as they reached the entrance of the vault. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the underlying tension. She wasn't just worried about the physical threats. The vault itself seemed to hold something far more dangerous, secrets that could change everything. They stepped into the darkness, the air thick with dust and the scent of old stone. The entrance closed behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them inside. The silence was suffocating, but Jake noticed Lyra's eyes flicker with something deeper than fear, something that resembled hope. The vault was more than just a hiding place. It was a living memory of her people's greatness. Ancient carvings adorned the walls, depicting scenes of her ancestors, the rulers of a vast empire, their faces full of pride and power. But even among these images, there was something disturbing. Some of the carvings had been scratched out, as if someone had intentionally tried to erase the very history she had come to reclaim. As they ventured deeper into the vault, Lyra paused, her eyes locking onto a massive stone door at the far end. It was sealed with intricate symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the heart of her legacy, the weapon that could either restore her kingdom or destroy everything she had left. "This is where it ends," Lyra murmured, more to herself than to Jake. "If I can open this, if I can unlock what's inside, I will finally be free." Jake stepped closer, his hand resting on his blaster. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Whatever is behind that door, it's not just going to hand itself over." Lyra nodded, her eyes hardening with a new resolve. "I have no choice. I've lived in the shadow of my past for too long. It's time to face it." With trembling hands, she pressed her palms against the symbols, focusing all her energy into unlocking the vault. The door groaned, as if waking from a long slumber, and slowly began to open. But as the door creaked open, a low growl echoed through the chamber, a sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. He turned to face the darkness, his heart racing. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, a tall, cloaked being, his face hidden beneath a dark hood. His presence was menacing, his movements graceful but calculated. He wasn't human, Jake realized. He was something else entirely, someone from Lyra's past, someone she had feared. "You shouldn't have come here, Lyra," the figure said, his voice smooth, cold. "This is where your story ends." Lyra froze. "I knew they would come. But this time, I will not run." The cloaked figure stepped forward, revealing a glimmering blade, one that glowed with a strange ethereal light. Jake instinctively raised his weapon, but Lyra stopped him with a gesture. She stepped forward, meeting the figure's gaze with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you were part of the betrayal. You were one of the ones who helped destroy my family." The figure smiled, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Yes. You've grown stronger, haven't you? But it won't matter. You can never escape your fate. You were always meant to fall. Jake's pulse quickened. The tension in the room was unbearable. Lyra was facing not just a physical opponent, but the embodiment of everything she had lost. The ones who had destroyed her family. The ones who had erased her people from the galaxy's memory. "I will not fall," Lyra said, her voice now full of confidence. "I will take back what's mine." With a swift motion, she reached into her robes, pulling out an ancient crystal, one that Jake hadn't seen before. The crystal hummed with power, its light casting eerie shadows across the vault. As she held it in her hand, the vault seemed to come alive, the walls vibrating with energy. The weapon was awakening. The cloaked figure hissed, realizing what she held. "You have no idea what you're unleashing. You're playing with forces you don't understand." Lyra's grip tightened around the crystal. "No, I understand it more than you think." With a sudden, powerful gesture, she threw the crystal into the air. It shattered into 1,000 glowing shards, and the vault was engulfed in light. The figure recoiled, shielding his eyes. But it was too late. The light exploded, and with it came a wave of energy so powerful that it shook the ground beneath their feet. The cloaked figure let out a scream, but it was drowned out by the blinding light. The walls of the vault cracked and crumbled, the ancient power of Lyra's people surging through her veins, restoring what had been lost. In that moment, Jake knew that Lyra wasn't just reclaiming her throne. She was claiming her birthright. When the light finally faded, the figure was gone, reduced to nothing more than a pile of dust. The vault stood in ruins, but Lyra stood tall, the weight of her past finally lifted from her shoulders. She turned to Jake, her eyes brighter than he had ever seen them before. "It's done. It's over." Jake nodded, still in awe of what had just happened. He had witnessed history in the making. Lyra had reclaimed what was hers, and with it, she had forged her own destiny. She wasn't just the last of a royal bloodline anymore. She was a queen reborn. As they stood in the rubble of the vault, Jake realized that this was only the beginning. The galaxy would soon know her name, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a part of a story that was just beginning.